Okay, so let's talk about Sharia. You've definitely heard the word. It's everywhere in the news, but honestly, it's probably one of the most misunderstood concepts out there. So in this explainer, we're going to cut through all that noise and get to what Sharia really is.
So let's just start with the biggest question on most people's minds. Is Sharia just some single, ancient, rigid book of laws that never changes? That's the image a lot of us have, right? But as we're about to see, the real story is so much more complex and, frankly, so much more interesting.
The truth is, Sharia isn't some tangled, messy knot of rules. It's actually a very structured system. And to really understand it, we have to start with one absolutely crucial distinction. I promise, if you get this one idea, everything else will just click into place.
And that brings us to our first section, this huge difference between the divine ideal and the human struggle to understand it.
Okay, look at this slide. This right here is the single most important concept to grasp. On the left, you've got Sharia. Think of that as the big idea, the divine path. It's God's perfect, revealed ideal, found in the Quran and the traditions of the Prophet. It's the source. But on the right, you have Fiqh. And Fiqh is the human part of the equation. It's the centuries and centuries of scholarship, debate, and legal reasoning by brilliant minds trying to understand and apply Sharia. The best analogy I can think of? It's like the U.S. Constitution versus the entire library of Supreme Court rulings. One is the foundational source, the other is the massive, ongoing human effort to interpret it.
So now that we have that distinction, let's see how this all builds out. Because Sharia is way, way broader than just laws that a judge enforces in a courtroom. It's really meant to be a comprehensive guide for life.
And this is where we kind of have to shift our thinking. For a practicing Muslim, Sharia isn't just a law book. It's a complete roadmap for living a life of submission to God, which is literally what the word Islam means. It combines all the things that Western thought likes to put in separate boxes: morality, law, social etiquette, religious practice. It's all part of one seamless guide.
And just look at the scope of what it covers. You're talking about the big-ticket ritual duties, like the 5 pillars of prayer and fasting, but it also gets into everyday stuff, like what you eat, how you dress, even how you say hello to someone. It's meant to guide your personal conscience just as much as your public behavior. So you can see, most of this isn't law in the way we think of it. It's a much bigger moral and ethical path.
Now, to really appreciate the moral depth here, check out this table. Sharia doesn't just divide the world into legal and illegal. Nope, it puts every single human action onto this 5-point spectrum. You've got the obvious ones on the ends, obligatory acts like daily prayers, and forbidden ones like drinking alcohol. But the fascinating part is the gray area in between. You have recommended acts, things you're rewarded for doing but not punished for skipping. And then you have reprehensible acts, where you're actually rewarded for avoiding them but still not punished for doing them. This reveals a really sophisticated ethical system, a world away from some black and white legal code.
Okay, but what about the parts that are enforceable law, the stuff that happens in a courtroom? Well, that brings us to the actual structure of the legal system, which, let me tell you, has been seriously misunderstood in the West.
For a very long time, the dominant academic view in the West, shaped by big thinkers like Max Weber, went something like this. Because Sharia is based on divine revelation, it has to be irrational, it has to be rigid, and totally unable to adapt. The assumption was that it was just frozen in time. But see, that theory had one major flaw. It just didn't match what was actually happening on the ground. When researchers in the 1970s finally started digging into centuries of real court records, they found something completely different. Far from being rigid, the system they uncovered was flexible, it was pragmatic, and it was incredibly functional.
In fact, it turns out that the Sharia system has smart answers to the same big questions that every mature legal system has to deal with. First, how do you know what the law actually is? Well, a rule had to be derived from the core sources by a qualified expert. Second, how do you settle disputes? Through judges appointed by the state, who applied the established legal doctrines from their school of thought. And third, and this is so important, how does the law adapt? It evolved through interpretation, and by having the flexibility to draw on different opinions from different legal schools, it had change built right into it.
So this system, led by independent religious scholars, worked for over 1,000 years. But in the last century and a half, something massive happened. A huge transformation that shifted power away from the scholars and into the hands of the modern state. This timeline really shows just how radical that transformation was. For a millennium, the law was the domain of religious scholars. Then, in the 1800s, you start to see European influence, and states begin writing these massive, centralized legal codes. By the 20th century, these hybrid systems are everywhere.
And more recently, you have Islamist movements pushing to bring Sharia back, but they're doing it through a totally new method: state legislation. The biggest story here is this incredible transfer of authority from independent scholars to the government.
And we really can't overstate how big of a deal this was. Codification was a revolution. All of a sudden, the state, not the scholars, was in charge of defining the law. They took that vast, nuanced body of fiqh, with all its moral layers and different opinions, and they basically flattened it into a set of narrow, black and white legal articles. And in doing that, a lot of the original context and flexibility was simply lost.
So after all that history, where does it leave Sharia in the world today? Let's take a look at the modern picture.
So, what does it look like on the ground today? Well, as you can see, the influence of Sharia really depends on which area of law you're talking about. It's by far the most prominent when it comes to family law, things like marriage, divorce, inheritance. But if you look at something like commercial law, it's almost all Western-inspired. And even though many countries might mention Sharia in their constitution as a source of law, what that actually means in practice can be wildly different from one place to the next.
So, to wrap it all up, in the modern world, Sharia often serves as a powerful symbol of Muslim identity and a formal constitutional principle. But, and this is the key thing, its actual application as enforceable law is almost always filtered through the machinery of the modern nation-state. We're talking about legislatures, government courts, and national legal codes. It's a profound fundamental departure from its pre-modern form.
And this brings us to one last critical question to think about. We've seen this deep, important distinction between the divine ideal of Sharia and the human effort to understand it. So what happens when that line gets blurry? What happens when local human customs start getting mistaken for divine, unchanging law? What are the consequences when human traditions, sometimes even harmful ones, are presented as the absolute, unchangeable will of God? It's a vital question, one that's at the heart of so many debates in the Muslim world today, and definitely something to chew on.